There was a bottle on the shelf that looked exactly like water. Not like Sprite, not like 7-Up, not like anything that had come before it. Clear all the way through. No color, no caramel, nothing. But the label said cola. And when you cracked it open and took the first sip, your brain did something it had never done before. It tasted Pepsi and saw nothing. The signal and the sensation refused to match. And somehow, that confusion tasted like the future. At its peak in early 1993, that bottle was everywhere. It was in the vending machine down the hall at school. It was in the grocery cart on Saturday morning. It came tucked inside the Sunday newspaper in cities like Boston. A full-sized free sample, just sitting there between the coupons and the sports section. Parents bought it because the TV said it was cleaner. Kids brought it to the lunch table because nothing else looked like it. For one brief, strange, electric moment, Crystal Pepsi was the most talked about drink in America. Then the shelf was empty. No announcement. No farewell. One week it was there. The next week it wasn't. And it never came back. How does a product that captured the attention of an entire country in January disappear completely before that same year is over? That's the story. And if you remember that bottle, if you remember the way it looked sitting in a cooler full of colored cans, then this story belongs to you. It started with a number that was making a lot of people in Purchase, New York very nervous. By 1991, sales of classic cola were going flat. Not just slowing, flattening. The two giants, Coke and Pepsi, had spent decades locked in what the press called the Cola Wars, fighting over fractions of a percentage point in market share. But now something else was happening. Sprite was growing, 7-Up was growing, Snapple was growing. The lighter drinks, the cleaner-looking drinks, the caffeine-free drinks, all of them were moving up the sales chart while the dark colas sat still. David Novak noticed. Novak was the executive vice president of marketing and sales at PepsiCo, and he had the kind of mind that turned data into instinct. He was sitting in his office one afternoon, looking at what was winning and what was losing across the entire beverage market, when the pattern hit him. Everything gaining ground was either clear or caffeine-free, no exceptions. He picked up the phone and called Roger Enrico, the CEO of Pepsi, with an idea that was either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. Why not make a Pepsi that was both? Enrico listened. Novak made his case. He knew the stakes. "I knew I was playing with all the family jewel," he said later, "because the company is Pepsi Cola. But the numbers were real, the trend was real, and the window to act was open right now." Enrico gave the green light. What happened next was, by the standards of a corporation the size of PepsiCo, almost reckless. Novak brought in Surinder Kumar. If that name doesn't ring a bell, the flavor he created will. Kumar was the food scientist behind the taste of nacho cheese Doritos, one of the most recognizable flavors in the history of American snack food. He was the man you called when you needed something that had never existed before to taste exactly right. Novak handed him the assignment. Build a cola that was completely clear, caffeine-free, made with all natural flavors and no preservatives, and make it taste like Pepsi. Kumar went to work. What followed was not a quick process. PepsiCo tested more than 1,000 separate product concepts. Kumar's team ran through 3,000 different formulations before they found the one that worked. The solution was to remove the caramel color that gave traditional cola its dark brown appearance and replace it with modified food starch. The result was lighter in taste, slightly less acidic, and carried 20 fewer calories per 12-ounce serving than regular Pepsi, 134 versus 154. It wasn't Pepsi with the color stripped out. It was something different, something new. But Kumar had a warning. Without caramel color acting as a natural shield, the liquid inside the bottle would be vulnerable to ultraviolet light. Leave it in direct sunlight, in a gas station window, at a convenience store entrance, anywhere the sun could reach it, and the UV rays would break down the formula. The product would spoil. It would taste wrong. He said this clearly. It was documented. It was known. The warning was filed away because there was a deadline, and the deadline was not moving. Novak had set his sights on the Super Bowl. Super Bowl XXVII, January 30, 1993. He had already committed to a $40 million advertising campaign built around that date. He had $7 million earmarked for a single commercial that would introduce Crystal Pepsi to the entire country in one broadcast moment. Everything was pointed at that Sunday in January, and the clock was running. From Novak's first phone call to Roger Enrico to the moment Crystal Pepsi hit shelves nationwide was 9 months. 9 months for a major product launch at one of the largest food and beverage companies on earth. A few years earlier, it had taken PepsiCo 3 full years to launch the Slice brand. The bottlers, the regional companies responsible for actually filling and distributing the product, started sending signals almost immediately. The feedback coming back from the field was consistent and pointed. Great idea, real consumer interest. But the Pepsi flavor isn't strong enough. People are going to try this once. Getting them to come back is going to be harder. Novak heard it. He acknowledged it. The launch kept moving. The slogan they landed on was simple and perfectly calibrated for the moment. You've never seen a taste like this. It was accurate. Nobody had. That was the entire point. In the spring of 1992, test markets opened in Denver, Sacramento, Dallas, Providence, and Grand Rapids. The response was immediate and electric. People were calling friends in other cities, mailing six-packs across state lines, lining up to try a clear soda the way you line up for something you've heard about but can't quite believe is real. PepsiCo was pleased. The plan was working. The national launch was set. The Super Bowl commercial was in production, built around Van Halen's 1991 hit Right Now, though Eddie Van Halen himself was less than thrilled about the arrangement. The only reason we gave Pepsi the music, he said later, was because they were going to use the song anyway. They would have just recut it with studio musicians. We said, hey, wait a minute, we might as well get the money. The commercial was filmed. The bottles were shipped. The shelf space was negotiated and confirmed at supermarket chains across the country. Everything was in place. What happened next was the part nobody at PepsiCo saw coming, and the part one competitor in Atlanta was very quietly counting on. The first time most Americans saw Crystal Pepsi, they didn't buy it. They just stood there and looked at it. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. In a grocery store aisle packed with hundreds of products all competing for 3 seconds of attention, something that made a shopper stop and stare was worth more than any focus group result or sales projection. The bottle was 12 ounces of pure transparency sitting in a cooler full of browns and greens and reds. It had a clean white label with sharp blue lettering. It looked like it belonged in a laboratory or a science fiction film, not between a 2-liter of regular Pepsi and a row of Mountain Dew. People picked it up the way you pick up something you're not sure is real. They turned it over. They held it up to the light. Then they put it in the cart. That moment, the pause, the curiosity, the reach, repeated itself millions of times across America in the spring and summer of 1992. The test markets confirmed what the early consumer surveys had suggested. In Denver and Sacramento and Dallas and Providence, Crystal Pepsi wasn't just selling, it was generating conversation. Word traveled faster than the distribution map. People in cities where it wasn't yet available were hearing about it from friends and relatives in cities where it was. Six-packs were being mailed across state lines. A product that PepsiCo had kept under wraps for months was suddenly the most interesting thing happening in the soft drink aisle, and it hadn't even launched nationally yet. In Colorado alone, PepsiCo conducted interviews with 100,000 customers during the test period. The results came back strong enough that the company did something unusual. They fast-tracked a diet version. Diet Crystal Pepsi launched in Grand Rapids on August 8, 1992, and rolled into Colorado by October. They were already extending the line before the main product had even gone national. By December of 1992, Crystal Pepsi was on shelves across the United States. What it felt like to find it in the store that first time is something that's difficult to translate to anyone who wasn't there. The soft drink aisle in an American supermarket in 1992 was a specific kind of sensory experience. The cold air from the open cooler doors, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum, the particular clink of glass bottles and aluminum cans. You knew that aisle. You'd walked it 100 times. You knew exactly where everything lived. And then one day there was something you had never seen before, sitting right in the middle of all the familiar things, and it was the color of nothing. For kids, it was almost destabilizing in the best possible way. Cola was supposed to be dark. That was just a fact of life, like the sky being blue or grass being green. Dark liquid in a can or bottle, that's what cola was. Crystal Pepsi violated that assumption completely and offered nothing to replace it except the taste itself. And the taste was close enough to Pepsi to be recognizable, but lighter, less sharp, easier on the back of the throat. Not better necessarily, not worse, just different in a way that made you want to figure it out. The school cafeteria was where Crystal Pepsi developed its first real social life. Vending machines that had carried regular Pepsi for years were suddenly stocked with the clear version, and the dynamic around those machines shifted almost immediately. Bringing a Crystal Pepsi to the lunch table in early 1993 was a statement. It said you'd seen the Super Bowl commercial. It said you were paying attention. It was the kind of product that generated exactly one question from every person who saw it for the first time. What does it taste like? And the only way to answer that question was to take a sip. That dynamic, curiosity driving trial, trial driving conversation, was exactly what PepsiCo had designed for. What they hadn't fully accounted for was what happened after the curiosity was satisfied. But in the early months of 1993, that problem hadn't arrived yet. Crystal Pepsi was riding the crest of something larger than itself. The clear craze, as it was being called in marketing circles and consumer press, had caught hold across multiple product categories simultaneously. Colorless Palmolive dish soap appeared on store shelves. Colorless soft soap followed. Rembrandt put out a clear mouthwash. Miller Brewing tested a colorless beer called Miller Clear in Richmond, Minneapolis, and Austin. The logic connecting all of them was the same logic that had launched Crystal Pepsi. That transparency signaled purity. That clear meant clean. That a product with nothing to hide looked like nothing to hide. Parents who had spent years mildly guilty about the dark, syrupy colas their kids were drinking found Crystal Pepsi easier to reach for. It didn't look like it was doing anything wrong. It looked like it might even be slightly better for you, though the label said nothing of the sort. That perception, unearned, unverified, but genuinely felt, was worth millions of dollars in repeat purchases, and PepsiCo knew it. Full-size sample bottles were tucked into Sunday newspaper deliveries in major markets. Boston Globe subscribers opened their papers one morning and found a free bottle of Crystal Pepsi sitting alongside the coupons. The product was arriving in American homes not because people sought it out, but because it simply appeared, handed to them by the newspaper, by the vending machine at work, by the cooler at the gas station. The barrier to first trial was being systematically eliminated. In its first year of national sales, Crystal Pepsi captured a full percentage point of the United States soft drink market. 1 full point in a market worth roughly $48 billion. That translated to approximately $474 million in sales, a number that would be equivalent to more than $1 billion today. For a brand new product that had existed for less than 12 months, it was one of the strongest debut performances in the history of American soft drinks. The people who made it, sold it, and stocked it were watching something rare happen in real time. A product had connected. The idea had worked. The clear bottle on the shelf had done exactly what David Novak said it would do when he picked up the phone and called Roger Enrico. What was it about that bottle, sitting there under the fluorescent lights of the grocery store, that made it feel like something more than a soft drink? What made it feel, for that one bright window of time, like a glimpse of where everything was headed? The answer to that question lives in what happened next. In the 30 seconds of television that introduced Crystal Pepsi to the largest single audience it would ever have, on the last Sunday of January 1993. On the evening of January 31st, 1993, roughly 90 million Americans were watching Super Bowl LVII. The game was Dallas Cowboys against the Buffalo Bills, and Dallas was winning by a margin that had made the second half feel more like a formality than a contest, which meant that by the time the fourth quarter arrived, a significant portion of the viewing audience was paying more attention to the commercials than to the field. That was the moment PepsiCo had spent $7 million to own. The ad opened without a product shot. No bottle, no logo, no announcer, just music. The opening piano chords of Van Halen's Right Now from their 1991 album For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. The song had already been a hit, but what Pepsi's production team did with it was something different. They built a montage of images around the music. Athletes, astronauts, children, ordinary people caught in moments of motion and clarity. And over each image, they placed simple text cards with statements that felt less like advertising copy and more like a manifesto. Right now, someone is doing something for the first time. Right now, the world is moving forward. The bottle appeared late, almost as an afterthought, as if the drink were merely one example of a larger idea rather than the product being sold. It was, by the standards of Super Bowl advertising in 1993, unlike anything else in the break. Eddie Van Halen had not wanted his song used. He made that clear. But PepsiCo had informed the band that if permission was denied, they would simply hire studio musicians to re-record a version close enough to use legally. Van Halen's response was pragmatic. The only reason we gave Pepsi the music was because they were going to use the song anyway, Eddie said later. We said, hey, wait a minute, we might as well get the money. It was not an endorsement born of passion, but on television that Sunday night, it didn't matter. The combination of that piano line, those image cards, and the slowly rotating clear bottle produced something that felt genuinely cinematic, an advertisement that people watched rather than used as an opportunity to go to the kitchen. The next morning, Crystal Pepsi was no longer a product in a test market. It was a national conversation. What PepsiCo had built to get to that moment was not just a marketing campaign. It was a distribution machine of considerable scale, assembled in a timeline that made veterans of the beverage industry shake their heads. The nationwide rollout that began in December 1992 represented one of the fastest major product launches in PepsiCo's history. From David Novak's first pitch to Roger Enrico to the moment the product was available in all 50 states was 9 months. Less time than it took most companies to complete regional test marketing alone. The physical infrastructure behind that speed was formidable. PepsiCo's network of regional bottlers, the independently owned companies responsible for filling, capping, and distributing product across specific geographic territories, had been brought into the Crystal Pepsi supply chain and asked to move faster than standard protocol allowed. The bottlers had complied, though not without reservations. Their feedback from the first weeks of distribution was consistent. Consumer curiosity was real. First trial numbers were strong, but the Pepsi flavor concentration in the formula wasn't hitting the mark that loyal cola drinkers expected. People were buying it once. Getting them back for a second purchase was a different problem. That feedback traveled up the chain. It was noted. The machine kept moving. The marketing campaign extended well beyond the Super Bowl spot. PepsiCo invented, and this is documented, the world's first photorealistic computer-generated bus wrap printing for the Crystal Pepsi launch. In cities across the country, full-length transit buses were wrapped in Crystal Pepsi imagery. The transparent bottle reproduced at enormous scale against a clean white background. In 1993, that technology was new enough to stop pedestrians on the sidewalk. The buses themselves became moving advertisements that people photographed and described to others, extending the campaign's reach beyond any paid media placement. Full-size sample bottles continued to appear in Sunday newspaper deliveries through the early months of 1993. The Boston Globe program had been successful enough to expand to other major markets. The logic was straightforward. Eliminate every possible barrier between the consumer and first trial. Don't ask them to seek it out. Put it in their hands before they've made a decision. Let the product speak once it's open. Vending machine penetration was aggressive. School cafeterias, office buildings, hospital lobbies, college campuses, transit stations, anywhere PepsiCo had an existing vending relationship, Crystal Pepsi was inserted into the rotation. For many Americans under the age of 25, the vending machine was where they first encountered the product. Pulling a clear bottle out of the slot with the same mild disbelief they'd felt looking at it on the grocery shelf. It still didn't look like it was supposed to be cola. That dissonance remained useful for now. By the first quarter of 1993, the numbers reflected the scale of what had been built. Crystal Pepsi accounted for a meaningful portion of PepsiCo's quarterly profits. The company said as much publicly. The $474 million in first-year sales had validated Novak's instinct and Enrico's decision to move quickly. The product was in the market, it was visible everywhere, and the initial consumer response had justified every dollar of the $40 million campaign. But inside the distribution network, something quieter was developing. The bottlers were still reporting the same issue they'd flagged from the beginning: flavor concentration, repeat purchase hesitation, consumers who tried Crystal Pepsi once and returned to their regular brand without explanation. And Surinder Kumar's original warning about UV light sensitivity was no longer theoretical. Cases of Crystal Pepsi were showing up in gas station windows and convenience store entrances bathed in direct sunlight, exactly as Kumar had said they would be. The first reports of product that tasted strange, descriptions ranged from flat to something considerably less appetizing, were beginning to filter in from customers. The machine was running at full speed. The cracks were already there, invisible beneath the surface, waiting for enough pressure to become something that couldn't be ignored. And in Atlanta, at the headquarters of the Coca-Cola Company, a decision had already been made. A product was already in production. A strategy was already in motion, one that its own architect would later describe, without apology, as a kamikaze mission. There is a specific kind of cultural saturation that happens to certain products in certain decades, where the thing stops being a product and becomes part of the background of daily life. You stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the furniture in your own house. It's just there. It has always been there. The idea of it not being there doesn't occur to you because nothing in your experience has suggested that it could disappear. Crystal Pepsi reached that threshold faster than almost any new beverage in American history. By the spring of 1993, it had moved beyond the novelty phase. The first wave of trial, the curiosity purchases, the vending machine experiments, the six-packs bought because the Super Bowl commercial made it look like the drink of the future, had passed. What replaced it was something more durable, or at least it appeared to be. Crystal Pepsi had settled into the grocery cart the way established products do, not because people were still marveling at the clear bottle, but because it had become a known quantity. Families who had tried it in January were still buying it in March. Kids who had discovered it in the school cafeteria were asking for it at home. The product had crossed from novelty into routine, which is the only crossing that matters in the long-term life of a consumer brand. The distribution numbers reflected that transition. Crystal Pepsi was available in every major supermarket chain in the United States. It was in Kroger and Safeway and Winn-Dixie and A&P. It was in the regional chains, Publix in the Southeast, Meijer in the Midwest, Ralph's on the West Coast. It sat in vending machines in 48 states. It was in school cafeterias and hospital gift shops and the coolers at every gas station on every interstate highway in the country. 1 full percentage point of the American soft drink market sounds like a modest figure until you understand the scale of what that market actually was. $48 billion annually, contested by hundreds of brands across every conceivable format and flavor. 1 point of that number was $474 million. For a product that had existed for less than a year, that was not a modest figure. That was a declaration. The working of a household with children in 1993 developed its own Crystal Pepsi rhythm. It appeared in the refrigerator because a parent had picked it up at the grocery store, placed there alongside the orange juice and the milk with the same automatic reach that stocked all the other familiar things. It went into lunch boxes, the clear bottle fitting alongside a sandwich and a bag of chips, with the practical efficiency of something that had always belonged there. It came out at dinner on a weeknight when nobody had the energy to think about what to pour, because it was already in the door of the refrigerator, and it was fine and it was cold, and that was enough. That is the deepest form of product success. Not the Super Bowl commercial, not the bus wrap, not the newspaper sample bottle. The deepest form is when something earns a place in the unconscious routine of daily life, when it gets bought not because someone decided to buy it, but because it was there last week and the week before, and the hand just reaches for it without asking the brain for permission. For one season, Crystal Pepsi had that. The commercial that introduced it to the country had done its work precisely. The Van Halen spot wasn't selling refreshment or taste or even novelty, not exactly. It was selling a feeling, the feeling that right now in this moment, things were moving forward and you were part of that movement. The images of athletes and astronauts and ordinary people doing things for the first time were telling the viewer something specific. This drink belongs to people who are not standing still. The text cards weren't describing Crystal Pepsi. They were describing the kind of person Crystal Pepsi was for. And in the first months of 1993, that identity landed. People who remembered the commercial could not always remember every image in it, but they remembered the feeling of it. The piano, the sense of momentum, the bottle rotating slowly at the end, clear and clean against a white background. It had lodged itself in the memory the way the best advertisements do. Not as a piece of selling, but as a piece of experience, Saturday Night Live noticed. In 1993, getting parodied on SNL was a specific kind of cultural arrival. It meant you had penetrated deeply enough into the national consciousness that the show's writers considered you a shared reference point, something the entire audience would recognize without explanation. The sketch that aired featured Julia Sweeney and Kevin Nealon in a parody commercial for Crystal Gravy, a clear, viscous meat sauce poured over fried chicken, packaged with the same clean aesthetic and earnest futurism as the real Crystal Pepsi ads. The audience laughed immediately. No setup was required. Everyone already knew what was being parodied and why it was funny. David Novak watched the sketch. He did not laugh. He understood what it meant. They were basically saying it didn't taste good, he said later. SNL didn't write parody commercials for products that hadn't connected. The joke only worked because Crystal Pepsi was already famous enough to mock. But the specific nature of the joke, the implication that the clear equals pure logic could be applied absurdly to anything, was a signal that the cultural moment was shifting. The novelty was beginning to curdle into irony, which in 1993 was the first stage of cultural dismissal. Novak saw it. The numbers hadn't turned yet. The shelf presence was still strong. The product was still moving. But something had changed in the atmosphere around Crystal Pepsi, subtle enough that most consumers hadn't felt it yet, significant enough that the people closest to the brand could sense it coming. What was it about that clear bottle that had felt, for a single bright season, like it was showing everyone something they hadn't seen before? And why was that feeling already starting to fade? The answer was already in motion, and it had started in Atlanta 4 months earlier, on December 14, 1992, the day Coca-Cola put Tab Clear on American shelves. He was Coca-Cola's chief marketing officer, and he had watched Crystal Pepsi's launch with the kind of focused attention that is not admiration. It was assessment. He saw the test market results. He saw the Super Bowl commercial. He saw the $464 million in first-year sales and the cultural momentum building around a clear cola that his company had not invented and could not easily replicate without looking like they were chasing Pepsi's idea. And he made a decision that, by any conventional understanding of business ethics, was extraordinary. He would not try to beat Crystal Pepsi. He would kill it. The weapon he chose was Tab Clear. Tab was Coca-Cola's original Diet Cola, a product that had been largely irrelevant since the 1970s, sweetened with saccharin, packaged in a pink can that carried decades of cultural baggage as something your aunt drank when she was watching her figure. It was not a beloved brand. It was not a powerful brand. It was, in the language of corporate portfolio management, a legacy asset with minimal equity, which made it, in Siemens' calculation, the perfect instrument for a mission that was never meant to succeed. Tab Clear launched on December 14, 1992, just weeks after Crystal Pepsi had gone national. The strategy was built on a specific psychological insight. Crystal Pepsi was new enough that most consumers had not yet formed strong opinions about what it was. They had tried it, they had an impression of it, but the identity of the product was still being written in real time. Siemens' plan was to rewrite it before Pepsi could finish the sentence. Tab Clear was positioned as a diet drink, sugar-free, medicinal in its packaging and marketing, associated with the failing Tab brand and its saccharine aftertaste. The implicit message, delivered not through any statement but through sheer proximity and visual similarity, was that all clear colas were diet drinks, that all clear colas tasted like Tab, that the entire category was thin and joyless and not worth your dollar. Seaman described the strategy himself without euphemism in a 2011 interview published in the book Killing Giants. Tab Clear was a kamikaze effort, he said. We created an unpopular beverage on purpose, positioned it as an analog to Crystal Pepsi, and killed both in the process. Pepsi spent an enormous amount of money on the brand, and regardless, we killed it. Both of them were dead within 6 months. Born to die. Those were the words he used. A product built to fail so that its failure would take something else down with it. The damage Tab Clear inflicted was not immediate, and it was not obvious. Crystal Pepsi's sales did not collapse the week Tab Clear appeared. The mechanism was slower and more insidious than that. What Tab Clear accomplished was a steady erosion of the clear cola category's identity in the consumer mind. Every bad experience with Tab Clear, every person who bought it expecting something refreshing and got something that tasted like diet medicine, became a data point that the brain filed under clear cola, not under Tab specifically. The category was being poisoned by association, and Crystal Pepsi had no defense against a threat it hadn't anticipated and couldn't directly address. You can't run a commercial explaining that your product is nothing like a competitor's product without putting that competitor's product in the consumer's mind. Pepsi had no good move. They watched the category they had created begin to tilt. Meanwhile, the second crack was widening underneath the product itself. Surinder Kumar had been right about the sunlight. The reports started coming in from the field in early 1993, slowly at first, then with increasing frequency. Customers were buying Crystal Pepsi from gas station coolers and convenience store entrances, exactly the high sunlight locations Kumar had flagged during development. And the product was not tasting right. The descriptions varied. Some people said it tasted flat in a way that regular Pepsi never did. Others said there was something chemical about it, a back-of-the-throat wrongness they couldn't precisely identify. The most vivid description, repeated across multiple consumer complaints, was that it tasted like shoe polish. Without caramel color acting as a natural UV filter, the clear formula was breaking down under direct light exposure in ways that were invisible from the outside. The bottle looked perfectly fine. The liquid inside was clear and carbonated and sealed. There was no way to know, standing at a gas station cooler, whether what you were reaching for had been sitting in a sunny window for 6 hours. You found out when you opened it, and once you found out, you didn't reach for Crystal Pepsi at that gas station again. You might not reach for it anywhere again. The complaints reached PepsiCo headquarters. The scale of the exposure problem, how many retail locations were displaying product in direct sunlight, how many bottles had already been compromised, was impossible to measure from Purchase, New York. The regional sales reps who were closest to the problem were reporting it up the chain, but the chain was moving fast and the numbers at the top were still positive, and the Super Bowl commercial was still running in rotation, and it was easy from a distance to categorize the spoilage reports as manageable exceptions rather than a systemic flaw. They were not manageable exceptions. The third crack was the one that lived inside the product itself, and it was the one that no external competitor and no shelf placement decision had caused. It was the gap between what Crystal Pepsi looked like and what it tasted like. The fundamental cognitive dissonance that had made it fascinating on first encounter, but exhausting on the fifth. The human brain is extraordinarily good at building expectations based on visual information. When you look at a dark brown liquid in a glass, your brain prepares your mouth for a specific flavor profile before the liquid ever touches your tongue. The color is not decoration, it is information. It tells your nervous system what is coming. Crystal Pepsi removed that information entirely. The liquid was clear, the brain prepared for water or for something light and citrus forward like Sprite, and then cola arrived. Every single time. For the first sip, that contradiction was thrilling. For the 10th sip, it was just confusing. and confusion is not a flavor that builds loyalty. The bottlers had identified this problem before the national launch. They had said plainly that the Pepsi flavor concentration wasn't strong enough to anchor the experience, that without the visual cue of the dark color, the taste needed to be more emphatic, more unmistakably cola, to compensate for what the eyes weren't providing. That feedback had not translated into a formula adjustment. The 9-month timeline had not allowed for it. How long can a product survive on the strength of its own novelty before people start asking the simpler question, but does it actually taste good enough to keep buying? Crystal Pepsi was about to find out. The numbers that had looked strong through the first quarter of 1993 were beginning to soften. Repeat purchase rates, the only metric that measures whether a product has moved from novelty to habit, were not holding. People were trying it once, sometimes twice, and returning to whatever they had been drinking before. The curiosity had been satisfied. The loyalty hadn't been built. And inside PepsiCo, the people who were watching the weekly sales data most closely were starting to have conversations that nobody wanted to have out loud. David Novak knew before most people did. He had been the one who conceived the product, the one who pitched it to the CEO, the one who set the 9-month timeline and pushed the launch to the Super Bowl and built the $40 million campaign around a single clear bottle. He had more invested in Crystal Pepsi than anyone else at PepsiCo, which meant he was also watching it more closely than anyone else. And what he was seeing in the sales data through the middle of 1993 was not the story he had written in his head when he picked up the phone and called Roger Enrico 2 years earlier. The first quarter numbers had been real. The $474 million had been real. The Super Bowl commercial had done exactly what a $7 million Super Bowl commercial is supposed to do. It had introduced the product to the country and made the country want to try it. But introduction is not the same as adoption. Trial is not the same as loyalty. And by the second and third quarters of 1993, the distance between those two things was becoming impossible to ignore. The repeat purchase rate was the number that told the true story. Not how many people had bought Crystal Pepsi once. That figure remained impressive, a testament to the reach of the campaign and the genuine curiosity the product had generated. The telling number was how many of those people had come back for a second purchase, and then a third. The consumers who had tried Crystal Pepsi and returned to Pepsi or Coke or Sprite were not complaining loudly. They were not writing letters. They were simply not reaching for the clear bottle anymore. In the language of consumer behavior, they had completed the trial phase and declined to convert. In the language of the grocery aisle, the shelf velocity was slowing. Novak understood what was happening. He said so, plainly, in interviews years later. "It would have been nice if I'd made sure the product tasted good," he told one interviewer in 2007. It is a remarkable sentence, honest to the point of being almost brutal. And it captures the essential failure at the center of the Crystal Pepsi story. The idea had been brilliant. The execution of the idea, specifically the decision to prioritize speed and spectacle over formula refinement, had been a fatal miscalculation. The bottlers had told him. They had said it before the national launch, and they had kept saying it as the distribution rolled out. The Pepsi flavor wasn't strong enough. Without the caramel color providing a visual anchor, the taste needed to work harder to convince the consumer they were drinking a cola worth returning to. It needed to be more emphatically itself. Instead, it was lighter than regular Pepsi in a way that read, to many consumers, not as refinement, but as absence. As if something had been taken away and nothing had been put back. That perception, once formed, was nearly impossible to reverse. You cannot relaunch the first sip. The brain files its initial assessment and refers back to it on every subsequent encounter. The consumers who had decided, consciously or not, that Crystal Pepsi tasted like a lesser version of regular Pepsi were not going to change that assessment based on a new commercial or a price promotion. The damage was in the experience itself. The formula problem had a specific origin point that Novak was aware of and had chosen not to address before launch. Surinder Kumar, when he was brought in to develop the product, had not been given full access to the original Pepsi formula. The proprietary nature of that recipe, the exact balance of flavors and acids and sweeteners that had made Pepsi taste like Pepsi for decades, meant that Kumar was working from the outside, reconstructing a flavor profile without the complete blueprint. He had gotten close enough to generate $474 million in first-year sales, but close was not the same as right, and in the unforgiving mathematics of repeat purchase, the difference between close and right was everything. The UV light problem was not softening, it was getting worse. Through the spring and summer of 1993, the spoilage reports from the field had escalated from a background concern to a genuine crisis. Gas stations and convenience stores, the high-traffic, high-sunlight locations that represented a significant portion of single-serve beverage sales, were continuing to display Crystal Pepsi in exactly the conditions Kumar had warned about. The product was degrading on the shelf. Customers were buying it, opening it, tasting something wrong, and in some cases reporting that it had made them sick. The phrase upset stomach appeared in consumer complaint logs with a frequency that nobody at PepsiCo was comfortable with. The regional sales reps were in an impossible position. They were responsible for maintaining relationships with the store managers and gas station owners who stocked Crystal Pepsi, and those managers were now asking questions that had no good answers. Can I display this in the window? No. Can I put it in the front cooler by the door? Probably not. Can I return stock that doesn't look right? The answers to those questions created friction in the distribution relationships that PepsiCo had spent decades building, and that friction had a cost that didn't show up in any sales report, but was real nonetheless. Inside PepsiCo, the conversation about what to do with Crystal Pepsi was becoming more urgent and less optimistic. The options on the table were not attractive. A formula reformulation, actually fixing the taste problem the bottlers had flagged from the beginning, would require pulling the product from shelves, re-engineering the recipe, and relaunching under circumstances that would broadcast to every competitor and every consumer that the first version had been wrong. In the middle of a market share battle with Coca-Cola, that was not a move PepsiCo's leadership was willing to make. A targeted marketing response to Tab Clear was equally fraught. Addressing the confusion Tab Clear had introduced into the clear cola category would mean spending significant money to argue against a comparison that most consumers hadn't consciously made. You would be teaching people about a problem they didn't know they had in order to then solve it. The advertising logic didn't hold. What remained was the option that no one in the building wanted to name out loud. Let the numbers run. See if the product found a floor. Hope that the consumers who had built Crystal Pepsi into their weekly grocery routine were enough to sustain a viable business, even if the broader curiosity market had moved on. The numbers did not find a floor. By the third quarter of 1993, Crystal Pepsi's contribution to PepsiCo's overall sales figures had become negligible. The product that had accounted for a meaningful share of the company's quarterly profits in January was now barely registering. The shelf space it occupied was space that regular Pepsi, or Diet Pepsi, or Mountain Dew could fill more profitably. The supermarket chains, which had given Crystal Pepsi premium placement during the launch on the strength of the consumer excitement and the marketing investment, were beginning to ask their own questions about whether that placement was still justified. Sergio Zeman's kamikaze mission had worked with a precision that was almost surgical. Tab Clear was already being discontinued. It had served its purpose, and there was no reason to keep spending money on it. Crystal Pepsi, the product Tab Clear had been created to destroy, was following it toward the same ending, just on a slightly longer timeline. The SNL sketch had been a warning. The spoilage complaints had been a warning. The repeat purchase data had been a warning. The bottler's feedback from before the national launch had been a warning. Every signal in the system had been pointing in the same direction for the better part of a year. And who exactly was supposed to protect this product from the accumulation of decisions? The rushed timeline, the incomplete formula access, the ignored UV warning, the competitor who played a game with no rules that had brought it to this point. There was no clean answer to that question in the fall of 1993. There was only the decision that was coming. The end did not arrive with a press conference. There was no full-page advertisement in USA Today announcing a farewell. No CEO statement, no acknowledgement from PepsiCo that something significant was being removed from American life. The discontinuation of Crystal Pepsi happened the way most corporate retreats happen, quietly, administratively, through a chain of internal decisions that translated into purchase orders that stopped being placed, which translated into trucks that stopped making deliveries, which translated into shelves that stopped being restocked. By late 1993, PepsiCo had made the call. Production was winding down. The final manufacturing runs were completed, the last cases were loaded onto the last trucks, and the distribution network that had spent 9 frantic months getting Crystal Pepsi onto shelves across the country spent the following weeks simply not replenishing what sold through. There was no ceremony, there was no last bottle, there was just the slow subtraction of a presence that had felt, 18 months earlier, like it might be permanent. The final batches reached retailers in the early months of 1994. After that, there was nothing to ship. For most consumers, the disappearance registered not as a news event, but as a small domestic mystery. You reached for it in the grocery store, and it wasn't there. You checked the next aisle over in case it had been moved. You asked the stock clerk, who shrugged or said something vague about not getting any in lately. You went home without it, bought something else, and filed the absence in the back of your mind under things that had changed without explanation. There was no internet in the way we understand it now. No Reddit thread to check, no Twitter hashtag to search, no Facebook group where people were already gathering to share the same confusion. The loss was private, distributed across millions of households in millions of small, unremarkable moments of reaching for something and finding empty space. The children who had packed Crystal Pepsi in their lunch boxes that fall opened the cafeteria cooler and found it gone. The parents who had added it to the grocery list out of habit came home without it, having substituted something else without thinking too hard about why. The gas stations and convenience stores that had stocked it in the cooler by the register replaced it with whatever the Pepsi distributor sent instead. Life reorganized itself around the absence the way it always does. Automatically, without grief, because grief for a soft drink felt like too much, and because there was always something else cold in the cooler. But the absence was real, and for a specific group of people, the ones who had not just tried Crystal Pepsi but had genuinely loved it, had made it part of their weekly routine, had found in its lighter taste and clean look something that the other options on the shelf didn't provide. The disappearance left a gap that didn't fill on its own. Meanwhile, PepsiCo made one last attempt to salvage something from the clear cola concept. In the months after Crystal Pepsi was discontinued, they released a reformulated product called Crystal from Pepsi, a citrus cola hybrid that kept the clear appearance but moved away from the cola flavor profile entirely. It was a different product with a different identity, and it resolved exactly none of the problems that had ended Crystal Pepsi. It lasted a matter of months before disappearing as well, leaving no cultural trace and generating no consumer mourning. Nobody put Crystal from Pepsi on a petition. Nobody erected billboards demanding its return. It was a corporate maneuver, and it read like one. The New York Times, in its coverage of Crystal Pepsi's failure, called it a colossal blunder. The beverage industry trade press conducted postmortems that emphasized the formula problems, the tab clear sabotage, the UV light vulnerability, the insufficient timeline. Business schools began building case studies around the launch, using it as a teaching example for what happens when a brilliant insight is executed without the discipline to match. In 2014, Time magazine placed Crystal Pepsi on its list of the 10 biggest product failures of all time, alongside New Coke and the Ford Edsel. Sergio Zyman gave interviews. He described Tab Clear without remorse. He was proud of it. Not in the way you are proud of something you built, but in the way a chess player is proud of a gambit that worked exactly as calculated. Pepsi spent an enormous amount of money on the brand, he said. Regardless, we killed it. Both of them were dead within 6 months. It was the most honest account of what had happened to Crystal Pepsi that anyone in the industry ever offered, and it came from the man who had engineered the killing. David Novak, for his part, did not disappear into silence. He went on to run Yum Brands, the parent company of KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell, and by most measures had an extraordinarily successful career in consumer food and beverage. But Crystal Pepsi stayed with him. In a 2007 interview, he returned to it with a candor that most executives reserve for retirement speeches. "I still think it's the best idea I ever had," he said, "and the worst executed." He talked about the bottlers' warnings he hadn't fully addressed, the formula access he hadn't fought hard enough to obtain, the timeline he had set and refused to extend. "Once you have a great idea and you blow it," he said, "you don't get a chance to resurrect it." He was wrong about that last part, as it turned out, though not in any way that PepsiCo controlled. In 2013, a competitive eater and YouTube personality named Kevin Strala, known online as the LA Beast, purchased a vintage bottle of Crystal Pepsi that had been sitting in storage since 1993. He filmed himself opening it and drinking it on camera. The results were immediate and unambiguous. The 20-year-old soda, long since spoiled, produced a reaction that Strala did not attempt to hide from his audience. The video went viral. Millions of people watched it. And buried inside the comments section of that video and in the social media conversation it generated was something that nobody at PepsiCo had anticipated: a genuine, widespread, emotionally charged demand for Crystal Pepsi to come back. Not because people thought it had been great, not because the formula had been flawless or the execution had been perfect, but because it had existed during a specific window of their lives, and the memory of it was attached to things that had nothing to do with carbonation or caramel color. It was attached to being 12 years old, and to a particular kitchen, and to a particular Saturday morning, and to the feeling of a decade that still felt, in retrospect, like the last time things were simple enough to be excited about a clear bottle of soda. By 2015, two separate online campaigns were running simultaneously, demanding Crystal Pepsi's return. Kevin Strahl had escalated his effort into something that could no longer be ignored. Approximately 37,000 signatures on a change.org petition, tens of thousands of tagged comments across Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram, 15 billboards erected across Los Angeles, and a mobile billboard truck parked outside PepsiCo's headquarters in Purchase, New York, with a gathering of supporters in a nearby park on June 15th and 16, 2015. PepsiCo responded on June 8, 2015, with a letter to Strala written on letterhead bearing the original Crystal Pepsi logo. The letter read, in part, "We've had customers ask us to bring back their favorite products before, but never with your level of enthusiasm and humor. We're lucky to have a Pepsi superfan like you on our side." The letterhead alone, that clean white design with the original typography, was enough to generate its own wave of coverage. The product wasn't back yet, but the logo was, and that was sufficient proof of life to sustain the movement. In the summer of 2016, Crystal Pepsi returned to American retail shelves for a limited run, 20-ounce bottles at a suggested retail price of $1.79, available at major retailers nationwide. It sold quickly, not because the formula had been fundamentally improved, but because the people buying it were not buying a soft drink. They were buying a memory. They were buying 1993. They were buying the version of themselves that had stood in a grocery store aisle and picked up a clear bottle and thought, without irony, that this was what the future tasted like. PepsiCo marked the 30th anniversary of the original launch in 2022 with a contest. Winners received 6 bottle prize packages. The product remained unavailable for general purchase. The company had learned, perhaps, that scarcity served the mythology better than abundance had ever served the sales figures. The shelf where Crystal Pepsi used to live is occupied by something else now, has been for 30 years. Whatever filled that space in early 1994, whatever the Pepsi distributor sent to replace the clear bottles that were no longer coming, is long gone too, replaced by something else, and then something else after that. The grocery aisle moves forward. It always does. It doesn't leave markers where things used to be, but the people who remember know exactly where it stood. When Crystal Pepsi disappeared from American shelves in early 1994, the space it left behind did not stay empty for long. The grocery store abhors a vacuum with the same efficiency as nature. Within weeks of Crystal Pepsi's final shipments clearing retail inventory, the shelf real estate it had occupied was redistributed to products that were already waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Some of that space went back to regular Pepsi and Diet Pepsi. Some of it went to the category that had been growing quietly in the background all along. The new age beverages, the Snapples and Arizona iced teas, and clearly Canadians that had understood something Crystal Pepsi had missed. Those products were not trying to be cola. They were not asking consumers to experience the cognitive dissonance of a dark flavor in a clear container. They were lighter, fruit-forward, visually honest about what they were, and they absorbed the consumers who had wanted something different from traditional cola without the confusion that had ultimately undermined Crystal Pepsi's repeat purchase numbers. Clearly, Canadian in particular occupied a space in the mid-1990s beverage market that felt almost like a direct beneficiary of Crystal Pepsi's failure. It was clear, it was lightly flavored, it came in a distinctive bottle that rewarded the same visual curiosity that Crystal Pepsi had initially triggered. But it made no claim to be cola, which meant it created no expectation it could not meet. The consumers who had reached for Crystal Pepsi looking for something cleaner and lighter than traditional soda found in Clearly Canadian, a product that delivered exactly what it promised, without the flavor gap that had sent Crystal Pepsi's repeat purchase rate into decline. The broader industry absorbed the Crystal Pepsi story quickly and drew conclusions that shaped beverage development for years afterward. The lesson that circulated most widely in marketing circles was the one about the difference between trial and loyalty, about how consumer curiosity, even at enormous scale, is not a substitute for a product that delivers a consistent and satisfying experience on the fifth purchase and the 50th. Crystal Pepsi had generated curiosity in quantities that most new products never achieve. It had failed to convert that curiosity into the habitual, unconscious repurchase that is the only sustainable foundation for a consumer brand. The second lesson was about the vulnerability of category innovation to competitive sabotage. Sergio Zyman's Tab Clear strategy had demonstrated something that made product developers and brand managers deeply uncomfortable: that a competitor with sufficient resources and sufficient cynicism could destroy an entire new category by introducing a deliberately inferior product into it. The clear cola category had not failed because consumers didn't want clear cola. It had been actively murdered by a company that decided it was cheaper to kill the category than to compete within it. That lesson changed how PepsiCo and other beverage companies thought about category protection, about how quickly a new product needs to establish its identity before a competitor can define it from the outside. The third lesson was Kumar's lesson, and it was the most straightforward of all. Shelf stability is not optional. A product that spoils under conditions of normal retail display is not a viable product, regardless of how strong its marketing campaign is or how well its launch numbers perform. The UV light problem that Kumar had flagged during development, the problem that had been set aside in the rush to meet the Super Bowl deadline, had not been a minor quality concern. It had been a structural flaw that contaminated the brand's reputation at the retail level, specifically at the gas stations and convenience stores that represented millions of single-serve purchase occasions every week. Every customer who opened a spoiled bottle of Crystal Pepsi and tasted something wrong was not just a lost sale. They were an active source of negative word of mouth in an era when word of mouth was the primary mechanism of consumer reputation. David Novak carried the Crystal Pepsi experience with him for the rest of his career. He went on to become the chairman of Yum Brands, the parent company of KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell, and by any measure became one of the most successful executives in the history of American food service. But he never stopped talking about Crystal Pepsi. In interviews spanning decades, he returned to it with a consistency that suggested it had become, for him, not just a professional memory, but a personal one. "It's the best idea I ever had and the worst executed," he said in 2007. "Once you have a great idea and you blow it, you don't get a chance to resurrect it." He was not entirely wrong about that. The 2016 limited re-release had sold out, but it had not resurrected Crystal Pepsi as a permanent product. The nostalgia was real. The demand for the memory of Crystal Pepsi was real. The demand for Crystal Pepsi itself, as a daily beverage, as a refrigerator staple, as the thing you reach for without thinking, had not returned and showed no signs of returning. The product had been discontinued at a moment when its brand identity was still being formed, which meant that the identity that formed in its absence was the identity of something lost rather than something present. You cannot build repeat purchase on nostalgia. Nostalgia is, by definition, a relationship with an absence. The factory workers and the bottling plant employees who had been part of the Crystal Pepsi supply chain moved back into the regular production lines with the efficiency that characterizes large industrial operations. There were no plant closures specifically attributable to Crystal Pepsi's discontinuation. PepsiCo's manufacturing infrastructure was too large and too diversified for a single product's failure to create that kind of localized economic damage. The regional sales reps who had built their pitches around Crystal Pepsi's novelty and momentum shifted to the next product, the next promotion, the next reason to ask a store manager for premium shelf placement. The machine that had been assembled to launch and distribute Crystal Pepsi simply reabsorbed itself into the larger machine that had always surrounded it. What could not be reabsorbed was the memory. When people who were children or teenagers in 1993 describe Crystal Pepsi today, they are not describing a beverage. They are describing a moment in their own lives, a specific version of themselves, a specific kitchen or cafeteria or gas station, a specific feeling of novelty that belonged to a particular window of time that will not open again. The product was the trigger for the memory, but the memory is not about the product. It is about being young in a moment when something as simple as a clear bottle of cola could feel like evidence that the future was going to be interesting. When people signed that petition in 2015, when 37,000 of them put their names on a document demanding that a beverage company restore a product that had been gone for 2 decades, what exactly were they asking for? The honest answer is that they were not asking for Crystal Pepsi. They were asking for the feeling that Crystal Pepsi had represented, the feeling of standing in a grocery aisle in 1993 and picking up something that had never existed before and not knowing yet whether it was going to be wonderful or strange or both. That feeling is not bottled. It cannot be re-released in a limited run at 1.79 per 20 ounces. It belonged to a specific moment in American life, and that moment, like Crystal Pepsi itself, is gone. The beverage industry learned its lessons and moved forward. The clear cola category was buried so thoroughly by the tab clear strategy that no major manufacturer has seriously attempted to revive it in the 30 years since. The new age beverage segment that absorbed Crystal Pepsi's consumers eventually gave way to energy drinks, then to enhanced waters, then to hard seltzers, each new category following the same arc of novelty, curiosity, trial, and the long sorting process that determines which products earn loyalty and which ones earn only memory. Crystal Pepsi earned memory. That is not nothing. In the long ledger of American consumer products, most things disappear without leaving a trace in anyone's mind. Crystal Pepsi left something more durable than its sales figures deserved. A specific, vivid, widely shared recollection of a taste that existed briefly and then was gone, and the persistent, unresolved feeling that something real was lost when it left. There was a moment, sometime in early 1993, that belongs to anyone who was there for it. You were standing somewhere, a grocery store, a gas station, a school cafeteria, and you reached into a cooler or a vending machine and pulled out a bottle that looked like nothing you had ever bought before. 12 ounces of something completely transparent, sealed with a cap that twisted off clean, label white and simple against the clear glass. You held it up, maybe, the way you hold something up when you're not entirely sure it's real. The light came through it. There was nothing to see inside. No color, no cloud, no trace of anything that looked like what it claimed to be. And then you opened it, and the gas hissed out the way cola gas always does. That specific carbonation sound that your nervous system has been cataloging since childhood. And you brought it to your mouth and tasted something that your eyes had told you was impossible. It tasted like cola. Unmistakably, recognizably, stubbornly like cola. Your brain ran the check twice. Clear liquid, cola flavor. Clear liquid, cola flavor. The signals refused to reconcile, and in that refusal, in that half second of delighted confusion, was something that no amount of marketing could have manufactured and no competitor could have copied. It was the experience of genuine surprise, not the manufactured surprise of a new flavor or a new package design, but the surprise of a category assumption being overturned in real time, in your own hand, at the cost of whatever a six-pack cost at your local store in 1993. That feeling lasted exactly as long as the novelty lasted, which it turned out was not very long. But while it lasted, it was something. Crystal Pepsi was not a great product. The historical record is clear enough on that point, and the people who made it have been clear enough on it themselves. The formula wasn't right. The shelf stability wasn't solved. The timeline was too compressed, and the quality controls were too thin, and the competitor who destroyed the category it had created was playing a game with no rules that PepsiCo had no answer for. By any rigorous commercial standard, Crystal Pepsi failed. It failed quickly, it failed publicly, and it failed in ways that were largely preventable, which is the most instructive kind of failure and also the hardest kind to carry. But a product can fail by every commercial measure and still mean something. And Crystal Pepsi meant something that its sales figures and its marketing postmortems and its placement on Time magazine's list of biggest product failures do not adequately capture. It meant something because of what it was asking, underneath the clear bottle and the Van Halen commercial and the $40 million campaign. It was asking whether the things we assume are fixed, the color of cola, the look of something familiar, the relationship between what we see and what we taste, actually need to be fixed at all. It was asking, in the specific commercial language of a major beverage company in 1993, whether the future was allowed to look different from the past. And for one brief season, the answer that came back from American grocery stores and school cafeterias and gas station coolers was, yes, we'll try it, hand it over, let's see. That willingness, that particular openness to something new that characterized the early 1990s before irony became the default register of American consumer culture, is part of what people are mourning when they mourn Crystal Pepsi. It is not only the taste they are reaching for, it is the version of themselves that could pick up a clear bottle of cola and feel genuinely curious about it, without the reflexive skepticism that experience eventually builds into all of us. The product was an artifact of a moment in American life when novelty still felt like possibility rather than marketing. The people who built it deserved more time than they got. Surinder Kumar, who warned them about the sunlight and was not heard, and who did his best work on a formula he was not given complete access to. The ballers who said the flavor wasn't right and kept shipping it anyway because the machine was moving and there was no mechanism to stop it. The regional sales reps who stood in front of store managers and answered questions they didn't have good answers to. The workers on the production lines who filled and sealed and labeled millions of bottles of something that would be gone within a year. They were part of something that the history books remember as a failure, but they were also part of something that 30 years later still makes people stop and feel something when they see the original label. And the people who drank it deserve acknowledgement too. The ones who carried it in their lunch boxes and brought it to the lunch table and made it briefly into the cool thing to have. The parents who reached for it because it looked cleaner and came home to find their kids already knew what it was. The ones who went back to the store looking for it in early 1994 and found empty space and asked someone and were told it was gone and felt for just a moment the particular small grief of something being taken from the ordinary rotation of daily life. That grief is not large. It does not belong in the same sentence as real loss, but it is real in its own register. The way the loss of small, familiar things is always real. The diner that closes, the radio station that changes format, the candy that disappears from the checkout line. These are not tragedies. They are the minor subtractions that accumulate over a life and add up eventually to the feeling that the world you grew up in is being quietly replaced by a world you didn't choose. Crystal Pepsi was one of those subtractions, smaller than most, more remembered than almost any. Somewhere tonight, someone is trying to describe what it tasted like to someone who never had it. They are reaching for the right words and not quite finding them, because the right words for a taste that no longer exists are always just out of reach. What they will say, probably, is that it tasted like Pepsi but lighter, cleaner, like something that was trying to be the future and almost made it. The person listening will nod. They will not fully understand. You cannot understand a taste you have never tasted. But they will understand from the way the description slows down near the end, from the pause before the words, and then it was gone, that what is being described is not just a drink. It is a moment that was real and specific and unrepeatable, held in the memory of someone who was there, offered across the distance of 30 years to someone who was not. That is what Crystal Pepsi left behind. Not a product, not a category, not a lesson in brand management or shelf stability or competitive strategy, a memory that still has taste.